We're taking a look at just how unhinged the world can get and how far things spiraled with this next story. On March 3, 1973, a CBS camera crew rolled into Wounded Knee, South Dakota, expecting to film a demonstration. What they found instead was something closer to a battlefield. Armored personnel carriers surrounded the small settlement. FBI marksmen held their positions along the ridgeline. And tucked behind the barricades, gripping a Winchester rifle he hadn't fully learned how to use, was a 33-year-old man who just 3 years earlier had been showing wealthy San Francisco women how to foxtrot. That man's name was Russell Means, former ballroom dance instructor, accountant, rodeo worker, janitor, and now, somehow, the most wanted Native American man in the country. Over the next 20 years, the federal government would try locking him up, shooting him, stabbing him, and shutting him up entirely. None of it worked. Eventually, Hollywood came knocking instead. Russell Charles Means came into the world on November 10, 1939, in Porcupine, South Dakota, a settlement so small it was little more than a scattering of homes on the Pine Ridge Reservation, barely a dot on any map. His father, Walter Hank Means, was Oglala Lakota. His mother, Theodora Louise Feather, came from the Yankton, Dakota community in Greenwood. At birth, she gave him the name Wambly Ohitika, Brave Eagle. He was the eldest of 4 brothers, among them a set of twins, William and Theodore. In the early 1940s, Pine Ridge ranked among the most impoverished areas in the entire country. When Russell was just 3 years old, his family relocated to the San Francisco Bay Area, drawn by wartime shipbuilding jobs at Mare Island in Vallejo. California was billed as a fresh start. It wasn't. Russell grew up stuck between 2 worlds, never quite fitting into white suburban life, yet too disconnected from reservation culture to belong there either. His father struggled with alcoholism, Russell faced racial abuse, barely made it through school, and graduated from San Leandro High in 1958 by the skin of his teeth. He attempted college 4 separate times and finished none of them. Later, in his own memoir, he didn't sugarcoat what followed: skipped classes, petty crime, drug use, and a slow drift away from any sense of who he was meant to become. For most of the 1960s, years Means himself later described as his "I don't give a damn" period, he wandered across the western United States, cycling through an almost unbelievable string of jobs: rodeo worker, cowboy, janitor, printer, day laborer, computer operator, assistant golf pro, ad clerk, accountant, and then, the one that really catches you off guard, ballroom dance instructor, working in San Francisco's Mission District. The same man who would one day stare down federal agents was at that point teaching waltzes and foxtrots to paying clients. He drifted between Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Phoenix before finally ending up at the Rosebud Reservation, and that's where everything shifted. Means started suffering from severe vertigo and went to the reservation's clinic for help. The staff took one look at a native man stumbling around and simply assumed he was intoxicated. They refused to examine him for days. By the time someone finally did, an untreated ear infection had already caused permanent hearing loss in his left ear. The very system meant to care for him had written him off as just another drunk Indian. That was the moment Russell Means stopped drifting. His path toward radicalism didn't come out of nowhere either. Back in March 1964, his father, Hank, had joined a small group of Lakota men in a 24-hour occupation of Alcatraz. Island occurred under a federal abandonment clause. The occupation lasted just a single day, and barely anyone noticed. But Russell noticed.
Hank passed away in January 1967. The following year, Russell crossed paths with Dennis Banks in Cleveland, co-founder of a fledgling organization called the American Indian Movement. By 1970, Means had become AIM's first national director, And he brought something to the table that made him uniquely dangerous to those in power, not violence, but spectacle. He grasped a truth most activists of his era never fully understood, that a television camera could be the single most powerful tool a Native American organizer could wield. On Thanksgiving Day, 1970, he led the takeover of the Mayflower II replica in Plymouth and helped douse Plymouth Rock in red paint. In 1971, he staged a prayer vigil atop Mount Rushmore itself, forcing the country to confront Lakota's sacred land, carved with the faces of presidents who had broken every treaty they'd ever signed. The Black Hills, Pahasapa, had been formally guaranteed to the Lakota under the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty. The government seized them anyway the moment gold was discovered there. Means stood on the monument itself, and it made the evening news. That was exactly the point. In January 1972, Means filed a $9 million class action lawsuit against the Cleveland Indians and team owner Vernon Stauffer over the Chief Wahoo mascot. His reasoning was hard to argue with. Would the public ever accept a team called the Cleveland Negroes slapping a racial caricature onto merchandise and calling it entertainment? The lawsuit dragged on for over a decade before settling in 1983 for roughly $35,000. The team held on to the name for decades afterward, but Means had planted the seed of an argument that would eventually force change, even if he didn't live to witness it himself. In February 1972, a Raymond Yellow Thunder man named Raymond Yellow Thunder walked into a bar in Gordon, Nebraska. A group of white men grabbed him, stripped him below the waist, and forced him into an American Legion dance hall as entertainment for the crowd before throwing him back outside. 8 days later, he was found dead. Local authorities chalked it up to exposure and showed no interest in digging further. Means and Banks responded by bringing over 1,000 Native activists into Gordon and occupying the town until a second autopsy was performed. That autopsy revealed the truth. Yellow Thunder had been beaten to death. Manslaughter convictions eventually followed. For the first time, AIM had tapped directly into the raw, everyday desperation of reservation life, and the people of Pine Ridge saw firsthand what this movement could accomplish once it arrived with cameras rolling and refused to back down. That same fall, Means helped organize the Trail of Broken Treaties, a nationwide caravan of Native activists representing dozens of tribes, converging on Washington, D.C. in November 1972 with a 20-point manifesto demanding treaty reform, restoration of tribal lands, and an end to termination policies that had spent decades dismantling tribal sovereignty. Federal officials had promised sit-downs to discuss it. The moment the caravan actually arrived, those promises vanished into thin air. So Means responded the only way it knew how, by occupying the Bureau of Indian Affairs headquarters for roughly a week, causing over $2 million in damages. The Nixon administration scrambled to defuse the situation, offering around $66,000 in travel funds and pledging to review every point on the list. That review never happened, and Russell Means walked away with a lesson he'd carry for the rest of his life. The U.S. government only came to the table when it had absolutely no other option. On February 27, 1973, Russell Means, Dennis Banks, and close to 200 armed AIM members and Oglala Lakota residents took control of the small hamlet of Wounded Knee, South Dakota, the very site where, in 1890, the U.S. 7th Cavalry had massacred more than 200 men, women, and children. Means was forcing the nation to look directly at the place where its promises had died once before, and to watch history threaten to repeat itself live on television. Their demands were direct: remove Dick Wilson, the widely condemned chairman of the Oglala Sioux tribe, and finally honor the treaties the government had broken. The response from Washington was overwhelming. FBI agents, U.S. Marshals, and Bureau of Indian Affairs police descended on the area, encircling the settlement with armored vehicles, military helicopters, and enough firepower to flatten a small town.
Roadblocks sealed off every road leading in or out. Overnight, the entire Pine Ridge Reservation had turned into a militarized zone. For 71 straight days, this wasn't a standoff. It was an actual shooting war. Gunfire broke out after dark, night after night. Negotiations would start, fall apart, then somehow restart again. Supporters risked federal prosecution just to smuggle food and medicine past government lines under cover of darkness. 2 Native men lost their lives to federal gunfire during the siege. Frank Clearwater, a Cherokee man from North Carolina, and Buddy Lamont, an Oglala from Pine Ridge itself. A U.S. Marshal, Lloyd Grimm, was shot and left permanently paralyzed. Through it all, Russell Means became the face the country associated with the occupation. Behind the barricades every day, on the evening news every night, delivering statements with a controlled anger that infuriated federal officials. They couldn't silence him, they couldn't ignore him, and they couldn't figure out a way to end the standoff without turning someone into a martyr. For 71 days, the most powerful government on the planet couldn't force 200 Native activists off a stretch of South Dakota land. The siege finally ended on May 8, 1973, when Means and Banks surrendered. The charges against them carried the potential for decades behind bars. Their trial opened in St. Paul, Minnesota in 1974 and stretched on for 9 months. Prosecutors buried the defense under hundreds of witnesses and thousands of pages of evidence. On paper, an overwhelming case. Instead, U.S. District Judge Nickel dismissed every single charge. FBI agents had been caught coaching witnesses. Evidence had been manipulated. Wiretaps had been conducted without warrants. Nickel didn't mince words. He said the misconduct had polluted the waters of justice and openly wondered aloud whether the Bureau could be trusted to prosecute anyone fairly. But the government wasn't done trying. Over the following years, Means faced trial roughly a dozen more times. Assault, conspiracy, whatever charge could be made to stick. Nearly every single time he walked free, acquitted, or the case simply fell apart. The pattern got almost comical. Charge him, try him, lose, then charge him again. Along the way, he was shot 3 separate times, once in the stomach by a BIA officer, once when a bullet grazed his forehead during a drive-by, and once in the chest in what he described as an outright assassination attempt. 3 bullets. He survived every one. In 1975, a courthouse clash in Sioux Falls landed him a felony riot conviction, and he served roughly a year in the South Dakota State Penitentiary. While locked up, a fellow inmate stabbed him, and he survived that too. It wasn't until 2003, nearly 30 years later, that South Dakota Governor Janklow Bill finally granted him a pardon. Now here's the part almost nobody could reconcile. This armed revolutionary, the most wanted Native man in America, someone who'd stared down the FBI through a 71-day siege, turned into a committed libertarian, not a Democrat, not a Republican. His reasoning was simple. A government that had broken every treaty, stolen every acre it could get its hands on, and tried to erase entire cultures had no business dictating how anyone lived, Native or otherwise. In 1976, Andy Warhol selected Means as a subject for his American Indian Portrait series, paying AIM $5,000 for his time sitting for the work. Warhol ultimately created 38 paintings and 23 drawings from those sessions. One now hangs in the Denver Art Museum. Others have sold at auction for hundreds of thousands of dollars. The armed revolutionary had become a fixture of American pop art, and the contradictions kept piling up from there. In 1983, he signed on as the running mate for Hustler publisher Larry Flint's satirical presidential run. Then, in September 1987, he made a genuinely serious bid, seeking the Libertarian Party's presidential nomination at their national convention in Seattle. On the first ballot, he came in second with 120 votes, about 31%, losing out to a Texas congressman named Ron Paul, who pulled in 176 votes. That's how close the man from Wounded Knee came to a presidential nomination. 2 decades later, in January 2012, Means threw his endorsement behind Ron Paul's own presidential campaign. The two had been ideologically aligned all along.
He also ran for Oglala Sioux tribal president in 1974, challenging the very same Dick Wilson he'd tried to remove during the Wounded Knee occupation.
and lost by a disputed margin of over 200 votes amid credible claims of voter intimidation. In 2001, he ran as an independent for governor of New Mexico, but was blocked from the ballot on technical grounds. He tried for tribal president again in 2004, losing to Cecilia Firethunder, who became the first woman ever elected to that office. Russell Means never won a single election in his life. He won pretty much everything else. Then, in December 2007, he pulled off his boldest move yet, traveling to Washington, D.C. with a small delegation to formally declare the independent Republic of Lakota, withdrawing from all U.S. treaties and asserting sovereignty over portions of 5 states. No government recognized it. No elected tribal council backed it. Means didn't care in the slightest. He'd spent his whole life being told what couldn't be done. In 1992, director Michael Mann was casting The Last of the Mohicans, a big-budget historical epic headlined by Daniel Day-Lewis. Mann, who'd started out making documentaries, remembered AIM and told his casting director, Bonnie Timmerman, to track down Russell Means and Dennis Banks to see if either could act. Means got the audition call, but refused to cover his own airfare, so the production sent him a plane ticket. When he arrived at the airport and saw it was for coach seating, he simply turned around and left. A 51-year-old man with 0 acting experience, no agent, and no reason to expect a second chance walked away from the opportunity of a lifetime over a seat assignment. His own reaction, "Well, there goes my movie career." The production panicked, sent a limousine, and upgraded the ticket. After 4 separate auditions, Means landed the role of Chingachgook, the title character himself. An acting coach once told him the golden rule of acting was simple: never act. For a man who'd spent his entire life refusing to be anything but exactly who he was, that was the easiest advice he'd ever received. On set, he stayed exactly who he'd always been, someone who would not tolerate being disrespected. He discovered the production had hired over 900 Native American extras from tribes across the country and was housing them in poor conditions while paying them roughly $60 to $70 a day. Means organized a strike. By his account, he negotiated the pay up to around $100 a day and forced improvements to the housing. He also clashed with Mann over what he called the Huron village scene, blasting it as a racist rehash of old jungle movie tropes and demanding rewrites. When Mann cursed at him during filming of the canoe chase, Means walked straight off set. Producers responded by blocking him in his trailer. The real dispute was over a promised $25,000 tied to net profits, and Means, the former accountant, understood exactly how meaningless net profits typically were in Hollywood accounting. He demanded the money up front. When a producer threatened to have him blacklisted, Means fired back with one of the great lines in Hollywood labor history: "You tell me how many parts there are for 51-year-old Indian actors. You don't scare me." They paid him. He finished the film. He also formally adopted his young co-star, Eric Schweig, who played his son on screen in the Lakota tradition. Schweig, an Inuit man raised by a white adoptive family and struggling with that disconnection his whole life, was someone Means clearly recognized something of himself in. He also grew genuinely close with Daniel Day-Lewis, later visiting him in Ireland, the militant and the method actor finding common ground as 2 men who simply refused to fake anything. The Last of the Mohicans became a massive box office hit, and at 51 years old, Russell Means had an entirely new career. 3 years later, Disney cast the same militant who had once occupied federal buildings as the voice of Chief Powhatan in Pocahontas. And Means loved it. He called it the best film Hollywood had ever made about Native Americans. Sit with that for a moment. The man who'd painted Plymouth Rock red, faced down the FBI rifle in hand, and declared his own sovereign nation, was now lending his voice to a Disney animated musical, and he was proud of it. He went on to appear in Oliver Stone's Natural Born Killers in 1994, played Jim Thorpe in Wind Runner, portrayed Sitting Bull in the CBS miniseries Buffalo Girls in 1995, and took on Arrowhead in another James Fenner Cooper adaptation, Pathfinder, in 2007. He also made guest appearances on Walker, Texas Ranger, Nash Bridges, and Touched by an Angel. In 2004, he showed up on HBO's Curb Your Enthusiasm as Wandering Bear, proving the man from Wounded Knee could handle comedy too. His final roles, Benjamin Longshadow on Banshee and Big Jim in Gin, were released after his death. His son, Tatanka Means, followed him into acting and later appeared in Martin Scorsese's Killers of the Flower Moon. Means was also a musician, inventing what he called rap-a-rock, a fusion of hip-hop and protest music. His 1993 album, Electric Warrior, released on Sound of America Records, included tracks like Wounded Knee Set Us Free and Indian Cars Go Far. A follow-up album, The Radical, featured the provocative track Waco, the White Man's Wounded Knee. In 2013, he was inducted into the Native American Music Awards Hall of Fame. In 1995, he published his autobiography, Where White Men Fear to Tread, co-written with Marvin J. Wolfe, nearly 600 pages of American history told from